This is a moment in Jewish history. In the late 1970s, Saddam Hussein was not yet considered the butcher of Baghdad. The Iran-Iraq war would only start in 1980, and Saddam had yet to invade neighboring Kuwait. Iran had just experienced the Islamic Revolution of 1979, in which Ayatollah Khomeini became leader. France was engaged in procuring oil from Iraq and was supplying them with jet fighters, and in the mid-1970s they signed agreements to build what was to become the Osiraq nuclear reactor, named after Osiris. The two reactors were called Tammuz I and Tammuz II. Saddam Hussein pledged that the nuclear reactors were for strictly civilian peaceful purposes, but his violent rhetoric against Israel made Israelis think otherwise. In 1980, France began shipment of 12.5 kilograms of highly enriched uranium. Meanwhile, Israel was planning Operation Opera to take out the reactor. The history of the Jewish community of Iraq dates back to the days of Babylon, where the Babylonian Talmud was compiled. It was one of the oldest Jewish communities in the world. That came to an end in the 1940s during World War II. The Farhud was a massacre that took place in 1941 during the Jewish holiday of Shavuot, in which almost 200 Jewish residents were killed in the capital city of Baghdad, over 1,000 injured and hundreds of homes looted and destroyed. When Israel became an independent state in 1948, persecution against the Jewish community increased. Jews were initially forbidden to leave Iraq. From 1951 to 1952, Israel embarked on Operation Ezra and Nehemiah, in which over 120,000 Jewish Iraqis were airlifted to Israel. In the Six-Day War of 1967, Iraq sent troops to fight against Israel, but Israel's swift and decisive victory came too quick for them to be deployed. During the Yom Kippur War of 1973, Iraq sent troops and supplies to Syria during the fighting, including tanks, which fought against Israel along the northern border. So by the year 1980, Israel tried diplomatic means to dissuade France from supporting Iraq, which they feared would go nuclear, but to no avail. French physicist Francis Perrin, former head of France's Atomic Energy Commission, said Iraq was on its way to a nuclear bomb aimed at Israel. But a French ambassador said Israel had nothing to worry about. Their agreements stipulated that Iraq would not use the uranium for weapons. Saddam Hussein publicly proclaimed the reactor to be for peaceful means, but also frequently attacked Israel, stating in 1980, "Zionism is our worst enemy," and "it's either Israel or the Arabs." He said Iraq needed the reactor to protect themselves from what he called the evil Zionist entity. At this time, the Prime Minister of Israel was Menachem, who had lost much of his family in the Holocaust, and he took Saddam's threats seriously. He stated, "A giant clock is ticking over our heads. A nuclear Iraq is a grave danger to every man and woman in the state of Israel. Saddam Hussein will not hesitate to deploy a weapon of mass destruction against us." The Israeli Defense Force Chief of Staff Rafael Eitan prepared an elite squad of Air Force pilots for the mission. At this time, the Israeli Air Force was using American-made F-16 fighter jets. However, the Americans put stipulations on their use, and the Israelis knew that using them to bomb the reactor would have consequences. But it was something they were willing to risk. If Israel bombed the reactor after it became hot, meaning inserting uranium into the core, then the resulting explosion could cause great civilian casualties, so Israel decided to act sooner rather than later. 14 Israeli jets were to depart for Iraq, flying straight there and back with no refueling. They had to remove some of the fuel tanks to make room for weapons. The mission was delayed several times and finally scheduled for June 7, 1981. It was purposely timed to be on a Sunday, not a workday, so that no French civilians would be at the reactor. It also happened to be the Jewish holiday of Shavuot. One of the pilots, Lieutenant General Relik Shafir, said that the team had a sense that not all of them would come back. He said he was named after his grandfather, who was killed by the Nazis in a concentration camp, and said he thought he was flying for his family, who died in the Holocaust. The planes took off from Israel. They spoke only in Arabic and used Jordanian radio signals to avoid causing suspicion. The planes flew over the domed roof of the reactor and dropped the bombs, scoring direct hits. Then they departed before the Iraqis could respond. The reactor was destroyed, and all the planes returned safely to Israel within 2 minutes. And while most of the country was celebrating Shavuot, the possibility of a nuclear Iraq was eliminated. The book Israel's Best Defense by Air Force pilot Colonel Eliezer Cohen described it as such. 8 precisely dropped bombs would have been enough to cause complete destruction, but in all 12 1,000-kilogram bombs were used. The concrete structure collapsed and crumbled, leaving not a trace of the reactor's core and other installations. Foreign journalists in Baghdad reported the next day that 2 bombs penetrated the basement but did not explode. This death trap prevented the ruins from being cleared. The Osiraq reactor had descended into a hellish end in 45 seconds. Saddam Hussein was furious. It was discovered that the Iraqi soldiers in charge of the anti-aircraft batteries were on their lunch break when the Israeli strike took place. Saddam Hussein had the commander of the unit taken out and shot. All officers in his command over the rank of major were executed, and 23 other Iraqi officers and pilots were sent to prison. Saddam Hussein asked what he called all peace-loving nations of the world to help the Arab nations acquire atomic arms to challenge Israel. He threatened to, quote, destroy Tel Aviv with bombs, but we have to use the weapons available to us until we can rebuild, and our Arab brothers can help us in this respect. France pledged to try and rebuild the reactor, but that never happened. And what was the reaction? The United Nations Security Council unanimously condemned Israel, but Menachem Begin was defiant.
Israel has nothing to apologize for. We decided to act now, before it is too late. Then we shall defend our people with all the means at our disposal.
The American administration was none too pleased that the jets used in the strike were American-made F-16s. They temporarily suspended all further deliveries. President Ronald Reagan eventually conceded that Israel may have had reason for concern over Iraq and might have sincerely believed that it was a defensive move, but he said that the final determination as to whether Israel had violated U.S. law in using the American-made planes would be under review. Richard V. Allen, National Security Advisor to the Reagan administration, said the following.
I said, Mr. President, the Israelis have just taken out a reactor in Iraq using F-16s. He said, they did what? And I said, well, repeated myself. And he said, you know what, Dick? And I said, what's that, Mr. President? He said, boys will be boys.
General Alexander Haig was the U.S. Secretary of State. He had this to say.
The president went around the table, and with the exception of one member of the cabinet, there was a very strong anti-Israeli condemnation mood in the room. It was really rather vitriolic. Then we finally got around to me, and I said to the president, before this is over, we'll be on our knees thanking God Israel did what it did.
Indeed, the Gulf War began when Iraq invaded neighboring Kuwait in August 1990. Iraq shot Scud missiles into Israel. The United States got involved, and Menachem Begin said his decision 10 years earlier was now vindicated. After the Gulf War, Defense Secretary Richard Cheney visited Israel and gave Israeli Major General David Ivry of the Israeli Air Force a satellite photo of the remains of the reactor they had taken in 1991, with a note thanking him for the outstanding job they did 10 years earlier, which, quote, made our job much easier in Desert Storm. This has been a moment in Jewish history. For questions or comments and past shows, you can visit benbresky.substack.com. Thank you to all the listeners, and shalom.